Let me guess, you've heard it too. People aren't having kids because it's too expensive. Fix the economy and see how the birth rate bounces up. It's a very comforting thought, very simple and a bit too naive. Because if that were the case, then countries with the strongest safety nets, like free healthcare, paid parental leave, would be overflowing with babies, but they're not. They're in fact shrinking fast than countries which do not have these things. The goal of this video is not to attack people who are blaming the economy, for I believe they have valid reasons. Having a child is undoubtedly very expensive, when the average person is just staying afloat economically. Rather, the goal of this video is to bring attention to the cultural shift which has happened to our society, which I believe is the main cause for the declining birth rate, rather than the economic one being the dominant issue that most people claim. I just want to talk about how absurdly romanticized Europe really is in general by leftists, and by leftist I generally mean liberals. Even though it is a heavy capitalist society with some level of state intervention in regards to social service, which mainly Europe and Scandinavia is known for. I would argue that Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden are perfectly individualistic rather than perfect as most people claim. The birth rate in Norway fell from 1.85, which is already low, and this was in 2005, to 1.41 in 2024. You need a rate of 2.1 to have a sustainable birth rate, and Norway has been on a decline for decades regarding this. This tells us a deeper, more personal issue, one not rooted directly in economics but in culture, as I'm arguing in this video. In earlier decades, even when Norway was relatively egalitarian in terms of its gender roles, people still chose to have children, not out of compulsion, but because having a family was seen as a central part to one's life. Now the collective sense of purpose has eroded. Society increasingly values individual freedom and career ambitions above everything else. Parenthood, which was once seen as a natural and fulfilling part of adulthood, now feels like a sacrifice in a culture that glorifies independence and personal comfort. The social structure is there, but the cultural will to have children is definitely missing. As another example, Norway has a very high suicide rate despite its strong welfare state and high standard of living. This challenges the assumption that material security, which is very important regardless, but it doesn't guarantee well-being in itself. In a society where all practical needs are met, people often begin to confront the existential void left behind. Traditional anchors like religion, family, and community, sources of identity and purpose, have definitely weakened. One of the obvious ways European governments are trying to fix this mess is by mass immigration, which has been a hot issue and main talking point in every political spectrum. I will talk more about immigration later on in the video, but for now I would like to draw your attention to the fact that research has consistently shown that while first-generation immigrants often have higher birth rates, the second-generation descendants of those immigrants tend to exhibit fertility rates nearly identical to native-born women. What this means is that this is not a solution, at least in the long term. Unless Europe wants to keep on bringing people in the future, which I really doubt is going to happen, considering the fact that the far-right movement is growing and will get way worse in the future. Now, some of you might be wondering, why do we even bother? Who cares people are having lesser children? Well, actually, it's a huge problem because the European model and most countries function on the simple fact that younger people entering the workforce will replace the same amount of old people coming out from it. If the current trends continues, then by the time me and the younger generation enters the workforce, we would basically be hired as slave labor and will basically live in a shithole known as a gerontocracy, which will basically mean that old people will band together and vote for policies for their benefits, just like the boomers are doing right now, like increasing pensions and moving more taxes on to younger individuals, which will basically make your life a living hell. Hey, congrats on being born after the baby boom. Without a doubt, we live in one of the best times to be a human. Most of us don't have to worry about going off to war, toiling our backs on fields for our feudal lords, or dying of hunger, unless you're a child in Gaza, that is. What this really means is that we can afford to be individualistic, unlike our ancestors who needed to stay together and had to be very communal to even survive, which led to the societies previously being very pro-natalist, and children being seen as a non-negotiable part of anyone's life. Add to the fact that they had religion, and what you basically have is a very pro-natalist society. Especially in agrarian societies where having children meant that they would work in fields for you when they grow up. Women would usually have 6 to 8 kids, and only about 2 to 4 of them would actually make it into adulthood, which really meant that the population would actually be relatively stable in most times except for times of plagues and wars. Population growth really began in the 19th century when sanitation and vaccination and industrial agriculture really started to take off. So even if society before 19th century was way more conservative, their population rates were more or less stable. Industrialization led to people rapidly moving into cities, which saw a low birth rate as there is no real direct benefit to having babies compared to agrarian societies. A lot of people are wrong when they always claim that the birth rates were very high and low birth rates are just a recent phenomenon. Just as an example, the average birth rate in France was 2.2 back in 1930, which is still high compared to today but not super high. Everything changed after World War II and the baby boom happened. This is a very fascinating and unique moment in history where natalism was once again in full swing. Because for the most part, American economy was doing great and army men were returning home and the government was spending a ton for welfare programs and people just felt very hopeful. Everything started to change after 1960 when women got access to the first birth control pills. And also, women started to rapidly enter the workforce, which resulted the culture to shift to more smaller families and sexual activity being seen as a more casual thing. And if you were a woman, you didn't have to worry about being dependent on your husband and you generally had more freedom to yourself. All of this led to birth rate declining even more ever since. All of these factors leads us to today where there is no real alternative for countries to effectively control their falling birth rate other than immigration. Some countries like China, South Korea and Japan have tried to do so by introducing tax breaks and giving out money to people, which isn't doing anything to be fair. I mean, who the hell is going to have a child for a few $1,000s when it takes an absurd amount to actually raise a child? Raising a child is simply not a necessity anymore, but a 18-year-old legal contract with no exit. Because the economy is so shit that there is basically no guarantee that you would even find a job after you graduate. I admit the economy sucks and it's very disencouraging for people if they want children, but I believe even if you were to fix the economy, the birth rate would more or less stay the same. Because we have drastically shifted in our outlook on how we look at children and what role women play in society. It's a proven fact that richer countries tend to be more individualistic and naturally, children aren't seen as desirable. The economy asks you if you can afford children, while the culture asks you if you even want children. And for the most part, the answer to both of these questions are no. Unless mass cultural change takes place, governments cannot continue operating under the contradiction of declining birth rates and rising anti-immigrant sentiment. The current model of relying on mass immigration to offset demographic crisis will eventually become politically untenable as far-right movements gain traction, blaming not just immigrants but native women themselves for the fertility crisis. In an extreme scenario, it is increasingly likely that states will adopt hyper-natalist, pro-life policies with an authoritarian views. Imagine a future where women are financially penalized for remaining childless past a certain age, where access to abortion and contraception is severely restricted, and where motherhood is elevated to a moral duty enforced through state propaganda. I want to remind you that these things have happened before in our history and not that long ago. So I'm not talking about a fictionalized version of a dystopia. You might say this is an extreme case, and I would say you are right. It's extreme, but things can get pretty damn close to this in the future, because we already know the drastic political divide between men and women, and it's only going to get worse as the economic ramifications of low birth rates unveil itself. And we will see a very draconian measure be taken by state as it clings to stabilize itself, even by violating many civil rights, and it won't go down easy and things will absolutely turn violent. I want the last section of this video to be about immigration in general, because it's almost expected to talk about the current birth rate and how Western governments are trying to put a band-aid on it, which is by mass immigration. To clear all biases, I'm a leftist socialist, and I'm not trying to frame this in a ethnocentrist or a nativist view, because these things are incredibly complicated, and I'm simply not a bigot. Culture has changed and always will continue to change. People who claim to protect their culture need to realize that their culture had evolved and had been influenced by other cultures, and you simply cannot pause these things. However, I will say this, that the modern day European and most Western countries are all coping by bringing in mass immigration simply because their own natives are not bringing enough children. Modern day immigration is less about giving people a better life and more of a business. Western capitalists essentially don't give a shit about dignity, and they never did. Immigration for them is just a form of cheap labor and as a form of stabilizing their birth rate. And then they have the audacity to get angry, and a bunch of right-wingers campaign on basically reopening deportation camps. Immigration is an incredibly hard thing to do, and people don't naturally make up their mind one day and leave their families behind for a cold and a miserable country. I'm talking about you, Britain, I'm talking about you. People don't want to go there for cheap labor and cheap wages. These people are cogs in the system just like the natives. Meanwhile, the elites of the society are gambling on which neoliberal or fascist party is going to win the next election, which will give them more tax break. That's all for the video. Thanks for watching the video, and please subscribe and like the video. If it means a lot to me, and thanks again if you made it to this end.